Hello. The topic of this lecture is on a passage from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is, as far as anyone knows, the oldest book written with ethics as its own topic in the Western tradition. And Aristotle is going to give us a kind of blueprint for virtue ethics generally. Pretty much all systems of virtue ethics in the Western tradition really do go all the way back to this system that was laid out by Aristotle. The title is something that later scholars attribute to the book. Aristotle himself didn't title it. He simply dedicated the book to Nicomachus, which is a little ambiguous. Both his father and his son were named Nicomachus, so he could have been dedicating it to his father. He could have been dedicating it to his son. He could have enjoyed the ambiguity and was really dedicating it to them both. Nobody knows, and it doesn't really matter. But that is where the title, the Nicomachean Ethics, comes from. It would otherwise be a fairly awkward title. This here, of course, is Aristotle, or sort of. This is a photograph of a statue, which is a much later copy of a much earlier statue that was made by somebody who almost certainly never saw Aristotle. It would have been probably many centuries after his death. And so this is a likeness of what Aristotle probably looked nothing like. I believe that there are some contemporary accounts I have heard that said that Aristotle, contrary to the fashion of the day, went around bald and clean shaven. Certainly, it would not have been the predominant way that Greek men of the time went around, but there is some mention of that from at least some contemporary sources. It doesn't really matter, but by the time that this particular the likeness gets crafted, you're talking about a representation in the Roman world, and the Romans would have found it absolutely inconceivable to portray Aristotle, in some sense, the philosopher, as without a beard. If you're really curious about the whole beard thing, you can ask me about that independently. I don't want to sort of distract from the main issue here. In any case, Aristotle is going to be taking us through a basic outline. So the reading material is sort of excerpted, and it's arranged in the format of a kind of interview to try and get the basic idea of his system of virtue ethics through without having you have to read really large chunks of the Nicomachean Ethics. So one of the first things that Aristotle does very early in the process is he gives this really wise declamation here about precision. And it's remarkable. One of the remarkable things about the Nicomachean Ethics and about Aristotle's writing in general, and his teacher Plato's, frankly, is how relevant it all still is, even given that it was written basically 2,500 years ago. In a lot of ways, it's hard to imagine that something could be so valuable and so relevant still after all that time. And yet when you read your way through it, there's a lot of really, really good stuff in there. There's a lot of very interesting questions that are treated in a very interesting way. We still talk about some of these works for a reason. They're really good. But here's how Aristotle starts. And this is something that I've come back to, sort of over and over again. It's something that's really stuck with me through my academic life. So what he says that we should not expect more precision than the subject matter admits of. And the way he really puts it, he says, it's a mark of the educated person not to expect more precision than the subject matter will allow, right? And so basically what he's saying there is he's saying, look, we're going to be talking about ethics. We're going to be talking about the good, the ultimate good, the best life, right? The right way to be, the right way to live. And he says, if you're talking about a topic like that, you're going to be talking about things that he says are only for the most part true, right? Or that there's going to be some exceptions, right? That, he's like a human life is a really, really complicated, messy thing. And so you're not going to get anything that's super simple and super precise, but you're going to have to outline it, right? That doesn't mean you can't make progress on such questions. It's just that the progress you make is going to be hard won, and it's going to require a lot of, sort of caveats and exceptions and those sorts of things. And again, I think it's a nice little piece of wisdom that Aristotle is giving us here. You should not, as he puts it, expect precise proofs out of an ethicist or a political scientist, because they have to deal with things that are just sort of generally true. They're complicated, right? Similarly, one should not expect approximate proofs out of a mathematician who deals with things that are determinate and definite. So Aristotle starts off his account by wanting to talk about the good life, right? The good generally, and then he'll work his way into talking about ethics, and specifically then about virtue ethics. But he wants to start off by talking about the good life, and he gives us this thing that's called the function argument. You can find a lot of summaries of the function argument all over the place. This is how I usually summarize the function argument. It starts off with this observation that every action is aimed at some kind of a goal. The word end is usually used. So when you see the word end in some of these readings, they mean goal. And so everything is aimed at some kind of a goal. Everything that everybody does, they're doing it for some kind of a reason. Just ask them, right? Like, why are you doing that? Well, I'm doing this because I want it to do the, I'm doing this because of that. I'm doing this because of that, etc. And so, again, every act is aimed at some kind of a goal. And some of those goals, Aristotle notices, are subordinate to other ones. So if you ask somebody why they're repairing a bridle, they're like, oh, well, because I can't ride my horse without it. And of course, okay, well, what do you want to ride the horse for? Well, I need to go to battle with this army against this person. He's like, okay, why do you need to go to battle, etc. So the idea is that some of these goals are subordinate to other ones. You're doing it to accomplish a short-term goal that you need to accomplish a longer-term goal. And so he says, what's the ultimate goal? Right? What's the thing that, that human life is aimed at, right? Because of course humans do lots of things for lots of reasons during their lives, but what's the main goal of a human life? That's going to be his real question here. And that's where we get to point 2, as we see here. Accomplishing that goal then, right? Whatever goal that human life is aimed at, that's the characteristic function of whoever aims at it. And so, in other words, what makes a thing what it is the goal that it's aimed at. So the characteristic function of a house builder is building houses. The characteristic function of a flute player is playing the flute. The characteristic function of a horseman is riding horses, right? The characteristic function of a ship's captain is commanding a crew of sailors on a ship, right? That's what they do. That the thing that they do is what makes them what they are, right? Having a particular kind of a goal that's characteristic of a certain kind of act. And of course, every goal has standards of quality that come with it. And so you can have the goal of building houses. You can be a house builder, and what makes you a house builder is that you build houses. But of course, there are standards of quality, the things that make houses good, right? And, if you're going to play the flute, there's something that makes for good flute playing, right, as opposed to bad flute playing. And so all of these things have standards of quality. And so it only stands to reason that if every other action is like that, if every act has some kind of characteristic function, something that makes it what it is, and it has these standards of quality that come with it, well, then human life, being a thing, right, surely is aimed at some kind of a goal, and that goal comes with some kind of standards of quality. And that's why Aristotle is thinking about virtue in terms of what is it that's going to help somebody actually live the best life. So when you figure out what the best human life is, you will then figure out the standards of quality that come with the goal of living a good human life. And then that will tell you what we're actually aiming at. He says it'll give us a target, right? Something to aim at. And so he's going to be fishing around here a little bit, and I hope you notice when you're reading through the way that Aristotle's style of inquiry is. It's not a list of things that he knows or that he thinks or that, it's very exploratory, right? He sort of comes off as kind of like a sculptor, right? Who's going to, chisel out a little feature here or a little bit there, then take a step back and look at it, right? And ask some questions about it and say, well, if we try and do this, maybe we run into this problem. If we maybe think this other thing, we'll run into this other problem. Like he's very exploratory about the way he's writing this. And really, he doesn't have a lot of literature before him to rely on. In a lot of ways, he's addressing some of these questions in the way that they're being addressed for, as far as anyone knows, the first time. And he's really just trying to put it all down, trying to get a good picture of what's going on. It's a very sort of a beautiful way of approaching things, and I really do think that comes out in his writing style. And so he addresses this question. He's like, all right, what is the goal of human life? He says, if you just ask everybody, right? This is always one step that he does. He's like, if you want to know something, just ask everybody and see what they say, but don't just take that at face value. Think about it, right? And so he says everybody agrees that the goal of human life is happiness. Right, that's the word that's used in all the translations, and I said earlier that I would complain about that here, and here I am complaining about it again. Again, a lot of times, especially when we translate ancient Greek material, the word happiness is not quite right. The modern English speaker thinks of happiness as a kind of feeling of being happy, right? So it's like, oh, this makes me happy, that makes me happy, I'm happy about this, I'm happy about that. That is, you feel pleasure at that, right? That's usually how the modern English speaker uses the term happiness. That's not quite what Aristotle means, and so translating it that way can be a potential sticking point. Again, the word that Aristotle used that gets translated as happiness is a word called eudaimonia. That's a Greek term. It means something more like well-being or fulfillment, much more than it means like happiness in the way that a modern English speaker uses that word. But of course, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, everybody agrees that the goal of human life is happiness, that is eudaimonia. But then Aristotle says, okay, great, everyone agrees, wonderful. What is happiness? What is eudaimonia? And that's where some answers really start to diverge in interesting ways. So he dismisses some of the answers that other people supply to the question, what is happiness? What is eudaimonia? Because again, it's one thing to seek out some of these answers. It's another thing to accept them just blindly or something like that. And so, of course, you want to ask. And so he asks around. He says the masses. He says like most people, the person on the street, as it were, says that the life of pleasure is happiness. Aristotle, right, doesn't think so, right? And people have accused him for being elitist on this score, but it's possible to be both elitist and right. Again, he might be right, but he contends that this kind of life is sort of vulgar, right? Not really fitting of a human being. He'll actually have a better argument against this point a little bit later, but for now he's sort of like, yeah, I don't know. That just sounds too unrefined. It sounds too unreflective, too unthoughtful to really be, the best life for a person is just, the life of physical pleasure or something like that. And so he sort of dismisses that at this point. He says if you look at sort of what he calls the better class, the sort of upper classes of person, people who are a little wealthier, more influential, better educated, that sort of thing. Again, there's some social stratification to be aware of here. But he talks about this. He says politicians, meaning people who live a public life, he says that they say happiness is in honor, right? But Aristotle doesn't think that's a good answer either, because he points out that if the good life is honor, well, then that would require other people to honor you, right? And surely somebody could live well, that is, live the best kind of human life, without others around to honor them for it. Right. And in fact, in the reading, he says, look, if you really ask people about honor and why they should be honored, they'd say, well, they should be honored because they're actually doing something good. They should be honored because of their virtue, right? Because of their good character. And so he says, at any rate, even the people who think that honor is the best thing sort of think that virtue is better than honor, because they think you should be honored because of your virtue, right? And shouldn't be honored if you didn't have any virtue. So those are some troubles with some of the answers that people initially supply to the question, what is happiness? And Aristotle doesn't think either of those are particularly good. So one more way that Aristotle comes at the question, again, I think of him as a kind of sculptor who's going to, chisel a little bit out and then step back and then, step to the side, look at it from a different angle, come in, chip from another angle, take a step back, look at it, think about it, that sort of thing. And so he sort of takes another step back and he says, all right, look, if we're talking about the goal of a human life, then that has to be something that only humans can do, right? That's something that's characteristic of humans. It's got to be part of what makes us who we are, right? So whatever a good life for a human is, it should be a good life for a human and not just for something else. And this is where he comes up with this notion of the three lives, right? So he considers the life of mere survival, right? People have proposed this, that, is like usually fairly cynical, pessimistic people, but, they've proposed the idea that the human life doesn't really have a goal. Here we are, and basically we just try and survive as long as we can, and that's it, right? That's all there is to life, is just, you have it while you have it, and then when it's done, right? That's the life of mere survival. Aristotle does not think that this answer is right. And the reason he thinks that is because even plants do this, right? So again, if something is to be the characteristic function of a human life, it has to be in some way unique to humanity. And just mere survival, he says, look, even plants do this, right? So that's not unique to us, right? Survival. Surely we want to survive. It's certainly a good to us to survive, but that's not the be all end all. It's not the ultimate goal. We survive in order to do something, right? In fact, I mean, what would life even be good for if it didn't have anything in it, right? So again, mere survival isn't just going to do anything for us. The second thing he considers is, again, this idea of the life of pleasure. And here's where he gives a little better, more of an argument than just, oh, well, this seems vulgar and crass to me, right? His argument is that, again, pleasure cannot be part of the uniquely human life. That is the goal for the best life for a human, because, again, even non-human animals do this. They pursue pleasures, right? They pursue comfort and, the kinds of animalistic pleasures that certainly those things are good, right? We do crave those things. But again, it is not the be-all, end-all. It's not the ultimate good, the ultimate goal for us. It's not characteristic of a human life as opposed to any other kind of life. And so that's Aristotle's argument against the life of pleasure being the best life for a human. And so instead he settles on this idea of the life of virtue and reflection, right? And he says that it has to, in some sense, be motivated by reason, right? It has to involve our higher faculties, right? Because those are the kinds of things that are unique to us. The way that we can represent our reasons to ourselves, right? The way that we can think about them, the way that we can conceptualize ourselves and think about good and evil and all those things. He said the good has to have something to do with dealing with that dimension of things, because again, that seems to be something that only human beings do, that's unique to our way of life. And so he calls this then the best life for a person, the life of virtue and reflection. In his words, he says, human good turns out to be an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. But of course, that leaves further questions. So before getting into this idea of what is virtue, I want to point out that virtue ethics is a little bit unique in terms of other ethical systems that we've seen so far. The previous moral theories that we've seen so far do tend to sweep prudence aside in favor of morality. Now, I should say prudence is looking after your own interests, doing what is good for you, right? Where morality is doing what is right, in a broader sense. And so egoism certainly said that prudence and morality were just exactly the same thing, but we saw how much there is wrong with that answer, and so we know that prudence and morality are not the same thing. But other moral theories ask us to sweep aside prudence to some extent. For example, utilitarians say that we should do whatever results in the best overall consequences out of all the options that are available to us. Well, those might not be the best consequences for you, right? But what morality requires of you is to do whatever would result in the best overall consequences. Again, whether those are good for you or not. Right? And so in some sense, morality is to take the front seat and, prudence the back seat. Kant, right, thought that you should do the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do, not because you wanted to, not because it made you any better off, simply because, you on pain of rational inconsistency, you just have to follow these kinds of moral rules. Otherwise, they're just, otherwise your actions have no moral content, right? And you're, on pain of irrationality, you're just, being inconsistent. But again, in all of these ethical systems, virtue and prudence are very much separate things. Whereas in the ancient world, certainly for Aristotle, they really are the same thing. He thinks that living the life of virtue really does mean living the best life for a human. And so that's at least something to really like about virtue ethics. And people who do like virtue ethics like this aspect of it a lot. There's this idea that living virtuously really actually does mean living well. Right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the things you think you want out of life are actually the things that are good for you. Right? This isn't virtue ethics lets you live how you want to live, but it does say that a reflection on virtue might lead you to live the best life, regardless of what you feel like that might be now or what you think that might be now. You might be wrong about what is actually good for you and what is virtuous, but a reflection on virtue and a striving toward virtue, Aristotle thinks, will lead you to the best possible life for a human. And so let's tune in a little bit to what Aristotle says about how to become virtuous then, how to get toward this notion of living the best possible life for a human. He says a couple of things about this. He says, virtue then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral, right? Two kinds of virtue. Intellectual virtue, in the main, owes its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time. While moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, whence also its name, ethike, is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos, which means habit. From that, it is also plain that none of the moral virtues arises in us by nature. For nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. For instance, the stone, which by nature moves downwards, cannot be habituated to move upward, not even if one tries to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive the virtues, and the virtues are made perfect by habit. A lot of really, really interesting and important stuff in that passage, which is why I've quoted it in full here. First off, notice that the course itself, right, is named ethics, right, which is a Greek word for moral virtue, and the Greek word ethike, right, moral virtue, is related to the Greek word for habit, right, and so notice what's going on here. It is not that you are supposed to do a particular thing. That's not really what morality is about, again, for a virtue ethicist. You're supposed to spend a lot of time and effort making yourself a certain way, right? And that requires learning, right? A lot of intellectual stuff, study, it requires somebody to teach you, it requires you to learn, and also it requires you to practice, right? To form these habits, to spend time making yourself into a virtuous person, right? So you have to change the way that you are, not just do a certain thing or not do a certain other thing. That's what Aristotle means by virtue. Right? It's a very different kind of an approach to some of those that we've seen before. So the second thing that's really important here is this notion of virtue being neither against our nature, nor are we virtuous by nature. So the idea is that if people are not born virtuous, and left alone, they don't necessarily become so. It does require work, but the virtues are not against nature. They're not against our nature. They're not the sorts of things that we just can't do. And he gives this very, very cool analogy of a rock. He says, by nature, the rock moves down. We can't make it do anything that's contrary to its nature. So if virtue were contrary to our nature, we wouldn't be able to be virtuous. And so he's like, so that can't be it, right? The characteristic function of a human life could not be something that humans are not capable of. Right, so virtue is something you can do, but it's not going to happen all by itself. Right, you actually have to spend time and effort learning things and then making it happen. And so speaking of making it happen and learning, there's Aristotle's ethics are very, very strong on this notion of habituation and training. It's habit forming, right? And training yourself. And so he says that we modify our character traits by habituation and training. So at some point, right, the way that the story goes, somebody has to teach us or show us what it means to be virtuous, to have certain kinds of virtues, like, for example, being trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, cheerful, obedient, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Right, just to pick some random example from somewhere. And that's what is meant by training, okay? And it's most effective for the young, right? So you train the young especially, and at some point the young are expected to take over that process of training and start reinforcing those habits themselves. And beyond just training, we have to form habits then that make the virtuous behavior part of our nature. So to make honesty a part of your character, you not only have to tell the truth, but you have to be honest until you tell the truth without even trying to or even thinking about it. Right? So instead of saying, should I tell the truth in this circumstance or not tell the truth in this? The honest person is one who it's so much part of their character that they don't even think about it anymore. Okay? Because they've habituated themselves to simply be honest. Okay? And when you do get a bad habit, which is going to happen to everybody at some point, it takes even more effort to first break the bad habit and then replace it with a good habit. Right? And this is one of those things that we tell people, smoking being one of the more common bad habits of our, the last several generations. A lot of ex-smokers will replace some of the time spent smoking or the money spent on smoking with exercise or other kind of worthy pursuits. And that helps, right? The idea is if you can replace a bad habit with doing something more worthy, more worthwhile, it helps, right? And eventually you become a different person. You stop wanting some things and you then start wanting others. And that's part of how to become virtuous. And so it's not just that practice makes perfect, right? You have to actually practice it the right way, right? It's perfect practice that makes perfect. And so notice at this point, we still don't know what virtue is. We know how to get it. We know why we want it. We know how it's supposed to fit into this larger context about living the best possible human life. But Aristotle hasn't told us yet what it is. And again, he's trying to work this out, right? This is in a lot of ways a first attempt. And for a first attempt, he knocks it out of the park. It's really, really good. And so if we're following him this far, then we can ask, how do we determine then which character traits, which parts of our character are virtuous? How do we tell how to make us ourselves? How are we supposed to train ourselves? How are we supposed to practice all this? And he answers as follows. He says, first, let us consider this, that it is in the nature of such things, like virtue, to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and health. He's going to give us a bit of an analogy here. And so he says, for to gain light on things that are imperceptible, those things we can't see, we must use the evidence of sensible things. What a wise way of looking at the world. He says, both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength. Similarly, drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys the health, while that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. So too it is then in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. Right, very, very profound. He's going to, again, use this kind of analogy. He says, notice, if you exercise too vigorously, you're going to end up just breaking your body down, right, and really destroying your strength. If you don't exercise enough, well, that will also destroy your strength, right? It says, and so the whatever builds strength, it's going to be something between too little of something and too much of something. Usually it's going to be like exercise. Similarly, your health, right, is destroyed if you have too much food and drink. Certainly it's destroyed if you have too little food and drink. But there's a sense in which if you have the right proportion of it, right, then that's going to be what sort of sustains and builds health. And it's a reasonable analogy. It's a totally reasonable analogy, and he thinks that character is this way as well. So let's take a look at some of these kinds of the framework that he sets up for us. So this is where he introduces the three dispositions, and this is his general method. Okay, he says there are three kinds of disposition, then two of them vices, involving excess and deficiency respectively, and one a virtue, videlicet, the mean. Right, and so every character trait that is expressed by some name or another, and we have lots of names for various character traits, and any competent speaker of the language knows whether those names describe good or bad character traits. Aristotle is going to maintain that each of these words will describe either a virtue, okay, which is a good thing, a good character trait, some vice of deficiency, that is a lack of a particular attribute, something that it's not enough of something, right? That's a vice, or a vice of excess, that is too much of something, right? And it's also bad. So the vices are bad, the virtue is good, and the virtue tends to live at some level in between these excesses of vice and deficiency. Now, before we get carried away with this, I want to mention a really common misinterpretation. I think Aristotle has been, quoted by many a layperson as saying, "Oh, everything's good in moderation," right? And that's really not quite right. I mean, I could see where they get the idea, but again, like many things that everybody says, it's a little wrong. So cowardice, for example, is not good in moderation. You shouldn't be a little cowardly, right? Cowardice. Cyanide also is not good in moderation. You don't want any of that. Rather, cowardice is what happens when somebody lacks courage. It's a vice of not having enough of something. Okay, courage is the virtue here. And when somebody lacks courage, they have the vice of deficiency of courage called cowardice. If somebody has too much courage, they have the vice of excess called rashness or recklessness or something like that. You can come up with all sorts of words for that. But the idea is that courage lives in this mean between having too little of a particular thing or too much of a particular thing. So it's not that everything is good in moderation. It's just that very often, right, the good comes between having too little of something that can be destructive and too much of something that can be destructive. Destructive to what, you might ask? Well, as you'll notice, most of these virtues are things that help people live fulfilling lives and also live along with other people, right? And anything that's destructive of those kinds of goals is going to be destructive of your ability to live a good life. So you'll see some more examples here. There are certainly as many virtues as there are positive ways to describe character, but some of the core virtues that I wanted to take some time to really take a closer look at, examples that Aristotle mentions frequently, are some of these. First off, temperance, which is the ability to resist what one ought to resist, even if that thing is pleasant. Right. This is a very, very important virtue in all times and in all places, but certainly these days. I think that temperance is, there's so many pleasant things to distract us and that we're so tempted to waste our time on, and the ability to put some of those things aside in order to do what must be done, to resist those nice things, those pleasant things when we need to do so, is certainly core to living an effective life, right? People who are very intemperate are going to have a hard time accomplishing any of the worthwhile goals they might have for their lives. So temperance is a very important virtue, and I think it's easy to see the connection between temperance and somebody living a good life, right? Being able to partake of things that are worthy and worthwhile. And so, of course, a person can have too little temperance, and they would have a vice of deficiency, right? And, thank you, Thesaurus, for this. A vice of deficiency of temperance could be called intemperance, licentiousness, sybaritism, overindulgence, right? In any case, it's somebody who satisfies their appetites to too great a degree or with too much frequency, right? And I think we all recognize a bit of that in ourselves and probably other people as well. But of course, you can take temperance too far, and that could also destroy your ability to lead a good life. After all, part of a good life is enjoying things that are pleasant, right? So we shouldn't always resist those things that are pleasant. That really would inhibit our ability to lead a good life. But we should be able to put aside those things that are pleasant whenever we need to. And so too much temperance would be something like asceticism, or, forgoing things which really are acceptable to partake of, right? Having this idea of like, no pleasant things, right? That would be harmful. Okay, but again, the virtue, temperance, seems to exist between having too little of something and too much of something. Fortitude, another really, really important core virtue. In some ways, it's the other side of the coin to temperance. So fortitude is the ability to pursue what one ought to pursue, even if it is unpleasant. Right. So another way to put this is it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. Right. And of course, again, daily life is absolutely full of things that are in some way unpleasant that you don't want to do. Maybe they're kind of boring. Maybe they're kind of tedious. Maybe they're, painful in some way. Like, exercise is something that everybody would do more of if it didn't suck. Right. If it didn't feel so bad sometimes. But, you do it. Right. You set it aside because it's good, it's beneficial. The long-term benefits outweigh the short-term discomfort. And again, jobs from like washing dishes to taking out the garbage to, all sorts of things. They're unpleasant. You're, dare I say, maybe even your reading assignments in philosophy are things that are to some degree unpleasant, right? They do require effort. They require you to sort of refrain from doing other things that perhaps you'd rather do. And so that's where a little of that temperance comes in. But fortitude is the ability to be able to push through that. Now, of course, you can have, if you don't have enough of that, it's easy to see how you might be sort of weak or irresolute. Essentially, you're not the kind of person who's able to do what needs to be done, and you could see how that could inhibit somebody's ability to live their best life. But of course, you could have too much of it. You could be ascetic or sort of overly stoic, right? Certainly, you don't want to seek out unpleasantness, right? Again, part of living a good life is avoiding certain things that are unpleasant, but sometimes you can't, and you have to know when that is and be able to just sort of dive right in and push through it. That's fortitude. And of course, there are other virtues as well. And again, many dozens of things can qualify as virtues, but I just wanted to narrow the list a little bit. Some of our virtues involve social life, right? They involve our ability to live along with other people. And so friendliness is a kind of virtue, right? And of course, you want to, there's a way of being too friendly, right? Sort of clingy, so you don't want to be that way, nor do you want to be sort of cold, and hard to befriend, right? So the idea is that, again, there's a kind of excellence here, right? That you want to try and cultivate, and it takes learning. You have to see examples. You have to have people tell you things. You have to listen. You have to, seek out knowledge, and then you have to implement that knowledge. You actually have to practice. You have to do things to sort of make yourself a better friend. Truthfulness, right, is one of those things that it's very interesting. Truthfulness means being neither a liar, right, nor blunt or rude, because again, there's a kind of excellence with respect to truthfulness. And it seems like the kind of truthfulness that allows you to lead your best life, allows you to live with other people, means certainly not lying to people, not manipulating them. Certainly it means telling the truth, especially when that is warranted. But it doesn't necessarily mean saying everything that you're thinking. And so there's again a kind of a tightrope to walk there between having enough of something but not too much. And that's where the virtue lies, right? Is in that there. Wit, right? Aristotle thought that humor was tremendously important to human life, and I think if you've been a human for very long, I think you can understand why that is, right? Humor is tremendously important to all of us. But of course, even that is a virtue, right? That you have to cultivate in yourself, and it's something that you learn over time. So you certainly. You can have a deficiency of wit, right? You can be totally humorless, and that's going to inhibit your ability to live your best life and live along with others. But also having too much wit, right, where you're just a clown, right? You can't take anything seriously. That's also a vice, right? And so again, the virtue is somewhere in the middle there. For the last virtue I wanted to bring up something that actually does sort of violate the general pattern, that doesn't seem to be something that is good in moderation, so to speak, or it doesn't seem to be a mean between a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. And that is the virtue of wisdom, right? It's definitely a good thing. Wisdom is supposed to help live your best life. Better understanding. You can always do better if you know better. And that's what wisdom is supposed to be. And again, it's an exception to this general pattern. It's very clear that you can have a lack of wisdom, and that could harm you. Right? That's what we call foolishness, or is a lack of wisdom. And that's certainly a vice of deficiency. But there doesn't really seem to be any harmful excess of wisdom. It doesn't seem like you can be too understanding. It doesn't seem like you can be too wise, right? I mean, certainly it would be bad if you thought you knew more than you did, but that would be a way of being foolish, right? Is not understanding how much you do and don't understand, right? That's a kind of foolishness. And so actually understanding, like actually having knowledge and insight and all those sorts of things, it seems like the more of that, the better, right? And so wisdom seems to be something that it doesn't fit into the general pattern. There is no excess of, or the vice of excess in this case. And that's just exactly what Aristotle was telling us right at the beginning of the piece, where he said, look, this is one of those things where you can't expect 100% precision. You can't expect a simple system to fit everything in perfectly. There's always going to be, some things that are just not simple, right? That are a little bit more complicated. But that doesn't mean we can't come to a better understanding of them and use them to our best advantage. And so this is sort of the basic lowdown on how Aristotle encourages us to live the best possible life for a human, to live the virtuous life. And this is how he encourages us to identify and think about what virtue is and what vice is.